Good evening, everyone. My name is Tommy Boland, Agricultural Science Association President, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this IFAC webinar entitled Budget 2023, How Will It Affect You? The purpose of tonight's webinar is to bring you the detail of today's budget and to outline how it will affect your personal and business finances as a result. Budget 2023 has been described as a cost of living budget, a giveaway budget, and a budget designed to put money back into people's pockets. And we'll look at how accurate those descriptions are over the course of the next hour. It's great to welcome you all to this evening's webinar, and we welcome your participation and interaction. So please pose your questions for our presenters using the Q&A function, and the IFAC team will compile these questions and I will put them through to our presenters at the end of tonight's presentations. We have two excellent speakers for you tonight who you know and require no introductions really. We have Declan McAvoy, Head of Tax for IFAC, and Pat O'Toole, News Reporter with the Irish Farmers Journal. Declan and Pat will delve into the detail of tonight's budget in a moment, but we just look at some of the high-level detail of the budget first. It's been labelled as the largest budget in the history of the state, an 11 billion euro budget. The main budget consisting of 6.9 billion euro and a 4 billion once-off package to tackle the cost of living. There's also an income tax package of 1.1 billion, and we will see an increase in the lower tax band rate to 40,000 euro. So the question remains as to whether this will actually help to put money back into people's pockets, or will it fuel the flames of inflation? So now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker for tonight. Our first speaker is Declan McAvoy. Declan is an AITI Chartered Tax Advisor. He's Head of Tax for IFAC. Declan has extensive experience and expertise in personal and corporate tax planning, estate and succession planning, tax-based investment, and financial structuring for family and farm business. So Declan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tommy. I give a little bit of an overview of the budget and, some of the items that are shaping the budget. And I'll just get my presentation up there now, where we can look at the various issues. The first thing, that is the background to the budget is inflation. For 2022, the Department of Finance are predicting 8.5% inflation. And for 2023, they're predicting 7%. We have a housing market crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have a climate crisis, and that's all set against the background then of the COVID recovery, which has probably driven inflation because of pent-up demand. And moving on to the next overhead, the headline issues are in the budget and the technical tax changes are in the finance bill. And it can bring unpleasant surprises. And the finance bill is expected on Thursday, the 20th of October. Normally the budget is very heavy tax orientated. This budget is different, and my presentation will reflect this, that there's a huge amount of supports on social welfare and the welfare side. So moving on, as I said, background to the budget, other items, exiting COVID, the Ukraine war, the inflation issue, energy costs, and now we're moving into labour shortages across a load of industries. Moving on again, starting in the budget and some of the items that came up, looking at VAT, excise and a nasty levy that came in today. Hospitality industry, the hotel and entertainment industry, VAT rate 9%. But from March next year, that's going back to 13.5%. A change, some items have been reclassified to zero VAT, newspapers, certain health products, defibrillators. Nasty one for farming, flat rate VAT reduced from 5.5 to 5% from the 1st of January. Good news was the excise reduction on fuel is extended to February. But the nasty one that there was no mention at all in any commentary is to address some of the finances in the MICA redress, there's a levy of 10% on concrete products to come in from next April, which is going to drive building inflation. Moving on, housing, a serious issue that has affected the government and the last number of governments. So what they're bringing in is a number of measures, new €500 tax credit for private renters, an in-year credit, so it's going to be as you pay the rent, you're getting the credit, available from 2023. And in early 2023, there will be a credit available for the 2022 year. So there's a double benefit coming quickly to people. Living City initiative on housing extended, and now it's allowable over 7 years, the cost of refurbishment against your total income. Pre-letting expenditure for landlords. Previously, they were restricted to expenditure of 5,000. It's now up to 10,000, and the vacancy period reduced to 6 months where they can claim it. The Help to Buy scheme is extended for a further 2 years to 31st of December 2024, with up to 30,000 of a tax rebate available for people. And moving on, also in the houses, to generate more money, there's a vacant homes tax to come in. And what they're talking about, it's going to be on residential property, which is occupied for less than 30 days in a year. And where that happens, it'll be self-assessed at 3 times the LPT charge. The zoned land tax, which was announced last year's budget and brought in the Finance Act last year, local authorities at the moment are working on the maps, and they're to issue, the draft maps are to issue on the 1st of November 22. And at that stage, if any farmer or someone has land that they want dezoned, they can apply to the local authority to get it dezoned, to get it to fall out. And stamp duty on sites for building. At the moment, if you buy a builder or an individual buys a site to build a house, it's 7.5% stamp duty, but with a refund scheme available where you build a house on it within a number of years, and the stamp duty is reduced to 2%. So that 5.5% can be claimed back. Moving on. Education, a lot in education in this budget, and it's all to help the cost of living, to reduce the impact for families. Third level fees are to be cut with an immediate reduction of €1,000 for this academic year, maximum cost of 2,000. But there's a longer term plan then based on income. Where your income is under €100,000, you pay 2,500 maximum registration fee. Where it's under €62,500, it's a maximum of 1,500 registration fee. For primary schools, there's a new free book scheme to be introduced, pupil-teacher ratios to be introduced, so new teachers coming into the system. And also on the SUSI grants, there's positive changes with an increase in the grant rates of up to 14%, a double payment for 1 month, and also an increase in the income limit for accessibility, which will open up the grant for more people. Moving on to the next one. Social welfare, a lot in social welfare and a lot flagged over the last couple of days. A double child benefit payment before the end of the year. Carers and peoples with disabilities, there'll be a one-off payment of €500. There will also be a double social welfare payment in the weeks after the budget, expected before the end of October. And social welfare includes people on pensions. The Xmas bonus will stay again. So there'll be a double payment, one in October and one in Christmas. Welfare payments, including pensions, will increase by €12 a week. There's expanded income guidelines to widen the availability of medical card, fuel allowance, all those schemes. So it's going to be less restrictive and easier to get to. The fuel allowance, there will be an extra one-off €400 paid before the end of the year. And the living alone allowance, a one-off extra of €200. This is where a lot of the money is going on the one-off, the 4 billion support that's coming in one-off before the end of the year. So moving on. Childcare, increased childcare funding, better pay and conditions for childcare workers as there's more state support being put into the system. And it will save approximately individuals who have children in childcare approximately €175 a month. We're moving away probably moving towards a state-supported system on childcare over the next number of years. Moving on, carbon tax. Carbon tax has been outlined in the last number of budgets that it's a 10-year incremental increase to 2030. There's a 2 cent approx increase this year, but that's offset by a reduction in the national levy, that they have a national reserve levy, which will mean there's no increase effectively at the pumps, what people are going to pay. So any increase that will be at the pumps over the next couple of months will be got to do with market prices. But as of now, the carbon tax equates to approximately 12.5 cents a litre for petrol and diesel. And that's going to increase every year at 2 to 2.5 cents for the next 7-8 years. So moving on. Income tax changes. There's some welcome income tax changes. The higher rate of tax to only hit incomes of over €40,000 for a single person. For a married couple, €49,000 they can earn at the low tax rate. Personal tax credits are up by €75 to 1,775. The earned income credit, so PAYE if you're a worker, or the earned income if you're self-employed, up by €75 to 1,775. The home carers credit up by €100 to 1,700. A small change on a USC band, the second USC band, bringing it up from 21,200 odd to 22,900. Medical card, the reduced USC band of 2% where income is less than €60,000, that has been retained. And a surprise but a welcome addition was the small benefit exemption, where you could get €500 from an employer tax-free in the year, has now been increased to 1,000. Previously, you could only get one benefit in the year. Now you can get up to two benefits with a maximum of €1,000. So moving on. So if we look at it, a tax review of it, a single employee on €45,000 is €831 better off, where a married employee on €45,000 is €366 better off. The reason for that is that the single person was previously only able to earn €36,800 at the low rate of tax, where they've now moving out 3,400 odd income into the lower rate. So that's where they have it. It's the same for the self-employed individual, the same rationale applying, that the single person is just getting more take home and that. But as you get to about 50 or 55,000 euro, it equates for everyone. It is a very progressive change that is welcome. So moving on, SME business. The big news in this one was the energy grant, the temporary support that has been flagged. So the conditions of the scheme are you must be carrying on a trade, so a trading business, be tax compliant. The energy support is available on both gas and electricity. It'll be administered by revenue, and it's a self-assessment procedure where you will register for the credit. And how the credit actually works, there will be a 40% relief on increase over and above the same period in 2021. So you will look, if it's a November, December 22, you will look back to November, December 21, what you spent on gas and electricity. The first condition is the increase in your bills, utility bills, must be more than 50%. And if it's more than 50%, you get a 40% relief on that increase. It's capped at a monthly amount of €10,000, but it is subject to EU approval. That's something that has been flagged over the last week, 10 days, and it's now been delivered on. Hopefully the administration process and the registration process will be simple to claim it. If we move on, some small to medium enterprise reliefs, they're extended and enhanced a bit. The key employee engagement program, foreign earnings deduction, special assignee relief program, film credit, research and development, knowledge development box. They're all rolled along and enhanced a small bit. So moving on. Farm specific changes. It was light enough on the farming end of it this year, but a couple of farm specific changes that don't come as a surprise. Stock relief for both Young Trained Farmer and Registered Farm Partnership has been extended to 31 December 2024. That was flagged last year that it was going to be extended. It could only do a 1-year extension last year. Young Trained Farmer stamp duty, farm restructuring on CGT, farm consolidation on stamp duty have all been extended to the end of 2025. But it's agriculture block exemption related, and it's contingent on that being updated, which we understand will be updated by the end of the year. So moving on to the next one. There's a new farm tax allowance, an accelerated capital allowance on slurry storage. And the accelerated allowance applies on 50% of the bill cost over 2 years. And there's a 7-year normal write-off. So now you'll be able to write off 50% of it over 7 years and the balance over the remaining 5. What it does is it just front loads the allowance. So instead of writing it off equally over 7 years, there's 50%, over the first 2 years. And moving on, the effect of it. So if someone spends €100,000 on slurry storage, the normal allowance is written off at 15% a year per annum for the first 6 years and the balance in year 7. So the accelerated is going to now give us 25,000 in year 1, 25,000 in year 2, and 10,000 thereafter. So the first 2 years, you're accelerating up to 20,000 of allowances into it. And after that, then you're down to 10,000. So there will be a significant upfront tax saving, for people who are investing in slurry storage. And moving on, the one thing that the minister flagged during the summer was that on succession, on inheritance, and on capital gains, that there would be no tax changes. And he was true to his word. There's no changes to capital acquisitions tax or capital gains tax rates or bands. And a reminder, the current rate of tax is 33%. The thresholds for gift and inheritance tax to a child is €335,000. To a blood relative is 32.5, and to a non-relative is 16,250. But in the last number of weeks, there has been a lot of reporting around the changes that are imminent. And the Commission on Tax that reported last week, they have made recommendations that we move away from an ultra reliance on income and more of a wealth-based or an asset-based tax. So watch this space, as these taxes will change over the next number of years. But as flagged by the Minister, there was no changes in this budget. And the Minister has also said he is getting the Department of Finance and the Tax Strategy Group within the department to actively examine a lot of measures that are in the Commission on Taxation. So over the next number of years, we will see a lot of them being implemented. So that's the end. That's the summary of the tax issues that's in the budget. And those tax issues, they're a guideline. A lot of the detail will come out in the finance bill. So, what I'd say to people is wait until after the finance bill to start looking at some of the measures and implementing them. So, Tommy, I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Declan. Really appreciate the level of detail you got into the presentation, realising this information is so hot off the press. Maybe, Declan, just from my own perspective, one question for you before we move on to Pat's presentation. Did anything surprise you in today's budget, or was there anything omitted that you would have expected to see included?
Well, the surprise was the 10% concrete levy, if we call it. And the omission was something that baffles me on a personal level, is from the point of view with all the hullabaloo that was there over the summer and the early summer about the sectoral targets, and particularly agriculture getting a hammering, that it was very light on any tax stuff that was there. The only environment tax was an increase in the carbon tax. There was no new initiatives there to try and encourage investment into it. I know Pat will deal with some of the grants that may be available on it, but I thought there would be some extra tax breaks to try and encourage investment in straight away.
Okay, thanks very much, Declan. I'm sure Pat will pick up on some of those initiatives as well. So moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Pat O'Toole from the Irish Farmers Journal, where he's a news reporter since 2007. In this capacity, all types of stories and issues across sectors are covered. And Pat also works at Tillage Farm in Ferns in County Wexford. So Pat, over to you.
Thanks, Tommy. Evening, everybody. I suppose for farming and for agri programs, it's kind of a holding operation. An awful lot of this information could have been shared 10 months, 11 months ago because it relates to the cap. What we're seeing for 2023 is the vast majority of the commitment in spending for agriculture is the commitment to the new cap, which kicks in on the 1st of January 2023. We have learned a lot about the schemes, and Pillar 2 of the cap is co-funded. And if we move on to the next slide, you start to see that it matters a lot in terms of the dry stock sector in particular, which 85% of Irish farmers are predominantly cattle or sheep farmers, and they depend utterly on direct payments for their income. And there's significant changes in those income. The dairy sector and to a lesser extent the tillage sector are less reliant on direct payments, but that's not going to change, especially with the cost at the moment of farm inputs. Margins are going to be tight for the next year and the years ahead. We expect most farmers to be utterly dependent on payments. And if we move on to the next slide, you can start to see just how much money is involved. So that should be 2027 from 2023. My apologies. But a total fund of touching on 10 billion euros. The Pillar 1 money is coming exclusively from Brussels. It's coming from European taxpayers, including Irish taxpayers. But Pillar 2 is co-funded. 60% of that Pillar 2 money, which the Pillar 1 is direct payments, the Pillar 2 is for supports and for rural development. So the schemes like, we'll go through them in a minute, you see that that most of them are associated with Pillar 2. And 60% of that funding, 2.3 billion, is coming from the National Exchequer of that 3.861 billion. But there is a catch. That includes the money which is coming from the carbon tax, which is being pumped into agriculture, mainly into the Agri-Environment Scheme, which will be known as ACRES. And if we move on to the next slide, you'll see, so this is Pillar 1, very changed, nothing to do with today's budget, but we've got the, I suppose, a lot of the conversation in farming coming around the BIS, which is the new direct payment. Every farmer will get that on a flatter level. Then there are eco schemes, 25% of the budget going into a new Pillar 1 eco scheme, which is a follow-on really from the greening, not to be confused with the agri-environmental schemes in Pillar 2, such as REPS, EOS and GLOS. This eco scheme is really, it's farmers' own money, if you like. It's coming from the basic payment, and farmers will have to reach a little to access that money. The eco schemes, they'll have to access at least 2 of the 10 measures. Then you've got the CRIS, which is front loading. So that's being paid on the first 30 hectares. And then we've got the Young Farmer, a much improved payment scheme for young farmers to incentivize young farmers, a top-up payment on the basic payment. And then there's some money for fruit and vegetable proteins, and 600,000 for bees. So that's Pillar 1. Nothing to do with today's budget, but hugely important to farming. Pillar 2, everything to do with today's budget. 60% of this money is coming from the National Exchequer, and that money was committed today. So that's the areas of national constraint, once known as disadvantaged area payments. We've got the AECM, the Agri-Environment Climate Measure. That is acres. And that 1.5 billion is coming from, as I say, the carbon tax. We've the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Programme. We've got the organic farming payments, which are massively increased. And then LEADER, on-farm investments. I'll be going through these later on, or a lot of them. But the money that has been committed today will fund these schemes. Next slide, please. So I suppose the 2 big ones, the basic payment and the areas of natural constraint. Last week, it was no coincidence that at the ploughing, it was announced the ANC payments. It hits an awful lot of farmers. over 80% of farmers receive an ANC payment. And then the basic payment, of course, every farmer, over 120,000 farms, are accessing basic payment. On to the next slide, please. So acres. Farmers pretty underwhelmed so far by the acre scheme. So what's being committed today? There's 30,000 farmers, about in or around 5,000, a little over 5,000, a maximum of 7,300. So that's for the general scheme, and then there is a cooperative scheme for farmers in high nature land. About 20,000 farmers will access that. An average, they reckon, of about 7,000 per annum for farmers, and a maximum of about 10,500, which brings it up to the kind of money that hasn't been seen since REPS. This was dubbed the new REPS at first. The big problem is that only 30,000 farmers are going to get in this year. The current loss scheme ends. It's been rolled over, and the rolled over scheme ends at the end of this year, which means that somewhere in the region of 55,000 farmers have participated in schemes over the years with some overlap, but there's a huge demand for acres. And no farmer will be in an agri-environmental scheme when acres opens. Now, they will only get 30,000 farmers in this year. There's only funding there for about 30,000 farmers at an average of about €5,500, because the money that's being committed today is somewhere in the region of 82 million of national funding, about 160 million overall. So I heard one person in the office today suggesting that we need a hectare scheme rather than an acre scheme, because this just will leave, it's about half of what is needed to satisfy demand. If we go on, now it is envisaged that the money will increase year to year. That 1.5 billion won't be exhausted by 81 or 2 million a year over the 7 years. So it will increase as the scheme fills up. It's expected that there will be 50,000 farmers in acres by the end of next year. The problem is that what we're hearing from advisors and planners is that for tillage farmers, there will be no problem getting into the scheme. For people in high nature land, it should be okay through the community scheme. There's some grumbling about the cost of entering the scheme, but the big issue is around dry stock farmers in particular, finding it hard at, there's been quite a bit of looking at it now, quite a few seminars, and farmers and planners are finding it hard to access enough measures to trigger a significant payment in the scheme. So that's going to be a big issue between now and Christmas, I think, as farmers formally apply for the scheme, and the realization will hit both sides as to whether this is going to work in the way it's envisaged or not. Next slide, please. So the beef scheme, the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Programme, which has replaced the BGGP, 20,000 herds, €150 a cow for the first 10, 120 per cow thereafter. There's 260 million over the 5 years, which is about similar to the BGGP. And then BBES, there was confirmation today that there will be a continuation of a scheme similar to BBES. So it looks like there's going to be a reduced allocation. It looks like, well, there may be a little more money in the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Programme than its predecessor. The opposite will be the case in BBES. The hope would be, and certainly the mood music from the department, is that when you combine the two payments, that suckler farmers will be about as well off as they were before in terms of supports in monetary terms. So the expectation is that there'll be a little less required of farmers in BBES, but that 28 million, as you can see, it's significantly back on the 40 million that was paid out last year and will be paid out, we expect, this year. Next slide, please. So organics, I suppose the big gainers in the new cap. So we're seeing 256 million allocated to organic farming and organic farmers for the 5 years between 2023 and 2027. It's going to be backloaded in that only 37 million is being allocated for next year. The challenge will be to get enough demand to take up all that 37 million. The aim is to have 7.5% of our land farmed organically. And that's a very low target compared to the EU average target of 25%. We're coming off a very low base. And as things stand, if you look at the table on the left, you see that there's been only a very slight increase from 2016 to 2021 in the number of participants in the organic scheme. Payments have actually slid back. The hope that government has is that there will be big uptake of this scheme next year. We'll have to wait and see. There is certainly a lot of interest from farmers, and there's no doubt that the cost of fertilizer in particular, and also of pesticides, has concentrated the minds of a lot of farmers, especially very extensive farmers who are using small amounts of inputs. The question is, can they reach across to reduce those inputs completely? Next slide, please. So you can see the payment rates there. They're pretty attractive in the first 5 years. And the very significant payments for maximum payments for larger farmers. So it may be that there will be some interest from what we might call commercial farms and larger farms and quite intensive farms. But that's quite a journey for a farm to take. So it won't be taken lightly. And I suppose what you always hear is that for a farm to move towards organic farming, it needs to be very well run and very well managed, because you don't have some of the easy answers if management lapses lead to issues on the farm that are in the medicine cabinet or in the chemical store. So I think not to be entered lightly. Next slide, please. So the sheep welfare scheme, there's an extra somewhere between 5 and 6 million. Now, this has not been officially announced, but we have been assured it's there. We're just waiting to see exactly where, which is often something that happens, as Declan says, on budget day. So it's going to cover the cost of shearing, €3 per ewe, somewhere between 5 and 6 million. Expected a 5 million or close to 5 million should cover the cost at €3 a ewe. So there was already an extra 2 to 2.5 million added this year to cover the change in the reference year, which brought in some extra ewes. And it's not expected there's going to be a big increase in applicants to the sheep welfare scheme. Next slide, please. So there's a few measures for tillage. Again, not particularly new. We've got the tillage incentive scheme, which was brought in this year as a direct response to the challenges we faced because of the cost of inputs, the explosion in fertilizer prices. 10 million was allocated this year, 10 million again next year. So this year was €400 per hectare for land which qualified. It had to enter tillage from grassland, so you were ploughing grass. There were some questions raised about that from a carbon point of view. It does release a lot of carbon. But there was a fear that we would be short of forage and fodder, and certainly the dry summer didn't help allay those fears. As in the south and east of the country, it's been a phenomenal grass year in the northern half and the western half of the country. So there's this year, people who availed of the scheme this year, if they leave those fields in tillage again next year, they will get a reduced payment of €200 per hectare, and if they plough up more land, they will get €400 per hectare on that new land. You must have a net increase in the tillage area over what you had in the previous year's BPS application. And there's a broad range. Initially, it was a narrow range. It was really only the grain crops, but maize and fodder beet and sugar beet, oilseed rape, all included. So that's the tillage incentive scheme, and open again next year. Next slide, please. So then we've the straw incorporation measure. That was 10 million in its initial year of 2021, 15 million this year, and quite significant uptake. You can see the column on the side, a broad range of crops, about 53,000 hectares in total, which will soak up a lot of that money. Certainly the 10 million would have been insufficient to cover. So 15 million was announced earlier this year. A lot of it will be utilised. It's back to 10 million next year, and there may have to be one of the questions we're going to be asking the minister. Some of my colleagues are in a briefing with the minister right now, is whether those two tillage schemes, whether there can be some movement of money in between them, because it's very possible that the tillage incentive measure will be underutilised and that this one will be oversubscribed. There's very little demand for straw at the moment. Fears that this scheme, which about 40 to 50,000 hectares of straw being chopped and reincorporated into the soil as an environmental measure, improving soil quality and reducing the need for bagged fertilizer. It ticks a lot of boxes, but the fears that there will be a shortage of straw certainly have not come to fruition in the first 2 years of the scheme. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a possibility to trade off between those two tillage schemes. Next slide, please. So finally, the protein aid scheme. So there was about 3 million in the old cap a year. So again, confirmation today that that's jumping to 7 million per year from next year on. There's obviously a pressing need. Again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown up the weaknesses structurally in Irish farming, and one of them is our dependence on import of proteins to feed our animals. And this protein aid scheme, it's envisaged that it will be working alongside with very good prices for proteins. And of course, the other thing is that beans, peas and lupins are nitrogen fixing. You don't have to apply bagged nitrogen. And with the cost of fertilizers, that's a very attractive element of growing proteins. So this is probably going to be popular, and that 7 million may not be enough. Probably will be fine for next year, but as we move through the next cap, you may see some pressure coming on there, and there may be an openness to increasing the acreage of protein crops. Next slide, please. So then the fodder support scheme. So this is the other, along with the tillage incentive. This is designed to support farmers with the extremely high costs of getting forage made, fertilizer costs and diesel costs combining to make a bale of silage or a pit of silage or a bale of hay exponentially more expensive than they were in 2021. €1,000 per farmer, 56 million budget this year, confirmation that it will be renewed next year, but it's unlikely to be a long-term scheme. It's in place for next year, and the question really will be, can we sustain schemes like this past 2023? It's probably unlikely. Next slide, please. So there's also 8 million allocated for lime spreading. We don't know the details as of yet, but obviously, again, it's about utilization of the nutrients that are present in the soil, unlocking them and optimizing the soil pH, particularly for grass growing, but for a broad range of crops. Next slide, please. So the multi-species sward and red clover scheme, again, there's going to be an increase in the budget for this. We don't know what that budget will be. The phrase we heard today was an enhanced budget. There will be a lot of interest in this because, again, there's been quick adoption. And I know, Tommy, that you made a presentation on this at a seminar in Enniscorthy Mart earlier in the year, and there was a lot of interest in it. Farmers have gone from being skeptical about multi-species swards and their place in grassland systems to being very eager and enthusiastic to adapt to them. So we expect this year about 10,000 hectares established across 1,700 farmers. And the expectation is, because it has proven successful, and especially where places in those parts of the country which experience drought, it's been quite robust in drought conditions and has outperformed ryegrass in some instances. So I think that the likelihood is that that enhanced phrase is one we may hear in years to come again. I think this is a scheme that has a future in the CAP. Next. So yeah, a forestry program. I'm sorry I didn't just get the figure across in time, but the reality is that it doesn't really matter how much is allocated, because there is a complete failure to unlock that money, unlock the sector. Farmers are unhappy with the licensing around felling and around planting, and the uptake of the level of support is unlikely to continue. So then we've got the dairy beef program, 5 million again, poor uptake. Farm safety initiatives and incentives will be continued next year. There's also 10 million allocated for soil sampling this year. That's increasing to 15 million next year. Again, questions over the administration of that scheme. There was a big time lag in the return of soil samples to farmers last year, and it remains to be seen if farmers will uptake that, because I know there's a lot of soil sampling going on farms right now. It's the time of year for it, and there needs to be a drive to make that scheme more user-friendly, I think. Next slide, please. TAMS. So there's an increase of 10 million, and this is to cover the proposed increased grant aid for solar panels. So there's going to be an investment ceiling of 90,000 euros compared to 80,000, which is the typical TAMS, and it's about an increased grant aid rate of 60%. Also, the standard grant rate will continue at 40%. Young farmers, and that's farmers under 40, and women farmers will receive a higher rate of 60% funding under TAMS. Across, we expect the various tranches of, or the various sections within TAMS to be pretty much the same as before, and you see them listed there. Next slide, please. So yeah, buildings, the pluses and minuses. So that was already mentioned by Declan. I suppose the budget day surprise was that 10%. There was no inkling of that whatsoever in a budget which was utterly leaked over recent days, and particularly yesterday. This one came from nowhere, and will affect farmers. It'll affect them quite significantly. We've had significant increases in concrete prices since COVID started, and building prices in general, building materials, and this is an additional 10% now on concrete coming in next April. Next slide, please. Finally, on renewables, as Declan said, very, very little information around what should be, a buzz sector in terms of the drive to achieve not just the sectoral target for agriculture, but the sectoral targets across all 6 of the emissions trading sectors, in particular energy and transport. So there's 24 million, we believe, for 2023 and 2024. That's 24 million across 2 years for anaerobic digestion. Now, we understand that to be existing funding, not new money just being re-announced. The increased TAMS for solar I've mentioned, and then the energy scheme, that's where 10,000 per month for farms. There was some speculation last week at the ploughing. Leo Varadkar was quoted as saying it would apply to farm businesses. Some concern that meant that sole traders might be excluded. Our understanding is that that is not the case, that all farmers will be eligible for the scheme. It's energy bills up to 10,000 per month over the 6 winter months. You must show increase in your energy costs of 40% over the equivalent period last year, which shouldn't be hard to do with the increases that have already been announced. Yeah, so that's quite significant. But we will be watching, as Declan said, the devil will be in the detail as we see the finance bill rolled out in the coming weeks. Back to you, Tommy.
Thanks very much, Pat. And again, a fantastic level of detail to get so soon after the budgetary announcements earlier this afternoon. So at this stage, I might invite Declan back to join us as well. And I just remind our audience and our viewers that if you have questions, please put them forward to the panel through the question and answer function. And there's a lot of questions have come through already, and we'll start working our way through some of these. If we don't get to answer all the questions tonight, IFAC will get back with answers to all the questions that have been posed. So some of these are kind of high-level questions. Some are quite specific, Declan. I'll start with a reasonably detailed one for yourself there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We bought land recently which included a house. Not me, no, I hasten to add, this is from a viewer. The house had been occupied prior to the transfer. However, the house is in poor condition, wiring unsafe, etc. It was and still is the intention of the owner to renovate the house. However, financially, they're not in a position to do so as yet. They have maintained the local property tax each year since on the house. The question is, will the house be considered a vacant home, and will they be liable for the vacant property tax? So I know it's maybe very hard to answer on such a specific question, but what are your initial thoughts on that, Declan?
Well, I'll just go back to what the minister said today. And what he said was that the tax will apply to residential properties which are occupied for less than 30 days. But there will be a number of exemptions to ensure that owners are not unfairly charged where the property may be vacant for genuine reason. And this is where the finance bill will bring out the devil in the detail. So we'd wait for the finance bill there. That seems to be a genuine reason. We'll see, will it fall into the exemption?
Yeah.
Tommy, if
Okay.
I might just come in there.
Absolutely, Pat.
If the house is unsafe, that would be a reason why it couldn't be occupied. But the other side, there is some good news, because while it wasn't formally part of the budget today, the minister announced at the planning last week that the existing scheme to renovate derelict houses, which can bring up to 50,000 to make a house fit for living in again, that grant is now being extended to rural farmhouses and rural houses in general. So that was an urban scheme, and that is one that your listener might well consider having a close look at, because they may well qualify for it.
Yeah, excellent point, Pat. Thank you. Declan, back to you then again with another question, and this time relating to the college fees cut. Is there a qualification criteria to be eligible for that cut in college fees, or do you have to be in receipt of the SUSI grant or anything?
For this year, no, it's €1,000 for everyone. So those who paid the 3,000, they'll get 1,000 back. But for next year, it's income related. Under 100,000, you get a 500 reduction, and under 62,500, you pay a maximum of €1,500. So it's not SUSI related.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Declan. And sure, when you have the floor there, I'll stay with you for another couple of questions, Declan. When does small benefit exemption come into effect? Is it the 2022 tax year or the 2023 tax year?
2022 is, well, as the minister said, it's his intention to have it in for 2022.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the next one, we were having this conversation just before we kicked off. Will farms qualify for the energy grant temporary support?
Yes. As Pat said last week, and I know I got a call from one of Pat's colleagues when the Taoiseach was in on the journal stand, and he was given the impression that it wasn't going to apply to your ordinary farm. But we can see today it does. It extends to farms and businesses. Yeah.
Excellent. Pat, over to you then for the next couple of questions. The proposed Women in Agri grants, are they getting access to the equivalent to the Young Farmers Top-Up Scheme, or is it just the TAMS that they're getting access to?
Just TAMS at the moment, but I do know that the Women in Agriculture Stakeholders Group and I think the IFA Farm Family Committee are pursuing the extension of the recognition of the underrepresentation of women in farm ownership to include those other incentives. So I think that that's an open one, and there's not a huge amount of money required to extend the cap top ups. The danger might be that from the department's point of view, if a large proportion of farmers were to pursue that, farm couples were to pursue that, that would make a significant change to the maths of the Pillar 1 payments. But there are ways of adjusting that. So I think we watch this space. It's very possible.
Yeah. And keeping on the topic of the Young Farmer Top-Up Scheme, Pat, for yourself, what's the proposed value per hectare to be paid next year? Do you have that at the moment?
I don't to hand. I can do I'll do some quick maths and I'll get that one back to you. Because I'll be honest, if you'd asked me this time last year, I'd have thrown all kinds of answers out. But it's been on the back burner in the last few months. But I'll do the maths on that and I'll give you an answer before we go off air. Yeah,
well, I might just transfer back to you then, Declan, to let Pat do his calculations there. This question relates to the rent rebate, Declan. Does the €500 rent rebate for renters apply to college students?
It applies to someone who's not getting housing supports off the state, but under principal private residence. So I would say no.
Okay, perfect. And then this is a more of opinion question, maybe, Declan, for yourself. Should the thresholds for capital acquisitions tax be increasing in line with inflation?
That's a dangerous one. Yes, in an ideal world, but if you look at where the trajectory is going tax-wise, it's probably going to go the other way because there's so many reliefs available for capital taxes. The Commission on Taxation, if you look and read their report, they're probably, the underlying thing is there's not enough tax being got out of wealth and assets. And as a result of it, there should be reductions in it. So while, yes, inflation would say yes, the policy document is saying no.
Okay. And then a question for you, Declan, again, in relation to the slurry storage capital allowance. Does that include the entire build, I'm presuming, or just the slurry storage element for the tank only?
We don't know. The finance bill, as I said, 20th of October, definitions, etc., will be in that, and we'll know whether it's only the tank or whether it's the full construction. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent. And that's something we're hearing again and again, that the detail still needs to be filled out on a number of these proposals.
Yeah, and that's where there can be, as we said at the start, there can be some very nasty surprises in the finance bill, restrictions that no one envisaged at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose this question can go to you both, but maybe Pat still seems to be working away there, Declan, so I'll direct it towards yourself. Good stuff, Pat. And again, we'll maybe deal with this question and then you can give us your calculations on the previous topic. Can you get a TAMS grant for solar if your house is on the same meter as the farm?
Yes,
that's open to both of you.
Yes, to my knowledge. But that does raise a question around metering. An awful lot of farmyards would have the meter running the house and the farmyard, a single meter. And around the energy grant, we need some clarity on how that's going to be assessed. A lot of farmers, and Declan would know this, when they're assessing their tax liability, they would attribute a portion of the electricity bill to the house, domestic, and then a portion of it to the farm and the farmyard, which would be, could be tax deductible. But so I think that around energy saving schemes, around night saver schemes, there's going to be issues emerging there, and I'm not quite sure how they're easily resolved.
Yeah. Absolutely. Maybe staying on the TAMS topic then for a moment, Pat. Is the new TAMS scheme separate from the present one? So if you've reached the 80,000 limit already, can you kind of go again?
Yeah, the clock starts. To our understanding, there's everyone starts from zero again on the 1st of January. We'll have to see if there will be priority categories, and it may be that farmers who haven't accessed the previous TAMs, if there's oversubscription in tranches, will get priority, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah. And just maybe staying on the TAMs as well, and then relating to the women farmers question earlier, if the woman is already in a partnership, will she qualify for the 60% TAMs?
Yes, as a
Yeah.
young farmer would. So if you have, my understanding is it will be the average where it's a partnership. So like if you were in a partnership, it's 60 and 40, you know, and it could be 60 and 60 if it was a partnership between two qualifying, whether two women or two young farmers, or a young farmer and a woman farmer. So that absolutely is the case. Yes.
Yeah. Actually, now, Pat, when you're on the hot seat, do you have those numbers for us?
So yeah, there's about 25 million a year allocated for the young farmer top up, and if it runs the same way as the last one, that what farmers got was a top up which brought them up to the average basic payment for their DED. So you got the average payment of the farmers around you, and the likelihood is that it'll be a similar mechanism this time, but the averages are going to be much more average around the country, because the reality is that there's been significant flattening of CAP through the establishment of CRIS, through the eco schemes. So it's likely that most young farmers all over the country will get very similar top-up payments. Too early, and a lot depends on the uptake, how far that 25 million has to be spread.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just remind our viewers at this stage we'll be bringing this session to a close in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. But please keep submitting your questions. And tonight's webinar is being recorded as well, so the recordings will be made available through the IFAC and through the Agricultural Science Association platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, etc. Pat, the opening date for the new TAMs. Do we have that?
We don't. There will be a tranche early next year, but we don't have the exact opening date. But the expectation is it will be in January.
Okay.
Largely because there's no reason to expect it will be significantly different in its operation from the current TAMs, which has been very successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of dates, then when will the Lyme aid scheme begin?
Yeah, grey area around that. We have no detail whatsoever, so we're awaiting that. But I think on all these schemes, farmers will want detail over the winter months. So we need to know by the end of January for all these things, so that farmers can actually get on with their plans and incorporate these schemes into their plans.
Yeah, and again, there's lots of questions coming through here, so I'm trying to move through them fairly quickly to get as many answered as possible. Is the 24 million for anaerobic digestion National Development Plan funding, Pat?
Yes, is our understanding.
Okay.
So
excellent.
as I say, pre-announced, yeah, not new money.
Yeah, perfect. And a question around the forestry schemes, Pat, and there was reports published recently saying we need to get to 18,000 hectares of afforestation per annum to reach our target land forestry cover by 2050 to achieve climate neutrality. It's a question and a comment. The Department have not outlined the new forestry schemes, what they will look like. Have they been finalised? Have they not been finalised and therefore not fully included in the budget? Can you shed any light on that for our listeners?
No, other than we'll get some briefings on that in the coming days. We'll get some briefings this evening and again tomorrow, and we'll get some flesh on the bones. But there has been a huge effort within the Department of Agriculture to try and address the huge structural issues that are there. But mixed success so far. One of the things, there are legislative changes in train, and they're going through at the moment, and they aim to transform the balance, I suppose, around planning issues, which are at the heart of the problems.
Yeah. You probably kind of touched on this question already, Pat, but maybe just to re-emphasize it, for a listener whose TAMS grant has been used up, is there a separate limit for the solar panels, or is it the 10,000 extra limit on top of the 80,000 limit, which has already been utilised? I think you've kind of, but maybe just
Yeah,
re-emphasize there.
the 80,000 limit would, but the good news is that the clock starts in January, so just hold off a couple of months and you're back in the game.
Just on the solar, Pat, there, including today's budget as well, that all schools are to be fitted with solar panels, and now they're being grant aided through TAMS. Are we going to run into supply issues?
I don't know. It may be, because I mean the production of a lot of the components. Now I do know that it's getting easier. I saw big 3D printers producing solar panels, membranes on the documentary there over the weekend. So maybe that this stuff becomes very easy technology to roll out. But like everything, we're hugely dependent on China for an awful lot of basic components. And large solar farms in particular, and roof solar panels, robust roof solar panels for Irish weather conditions, probably coming from at least some of the components coming from China, with the same problems that everything else has had since COVID broke supply lines, which have become just in time.
Yeah. A couple of questions then around dairy farming. And first one, maybe for you, Pat, is dairy milking equipment included in the new TAM scheme?
Yes.
Yeah. And Declan, this is probably might be as much a consultation as an answer that's required here from your own perspective. But do you expect a big increase in tax bills this year in the dairy sector, with milk prices at an all-time high? And this is the consultation bit. What can be done?
Well, yes is the simple answer. Yeah, profits look to be significantly up in dairying. And what can be done? It's case by case. Tax is very individual, and it's purely case by case. You'd have to look at everything that's possible. Look at, first of all, on-farm investment. Secondly, off-farm investment. Thirdly, structure, and look at everything you can do to minimise, the tax bill.
Yeah, thanks very much, Declan. And we're coming towards the end of the questions now. So if any of our listeners have a last question, get it submitted as quickly as you can. Pat, back to the solar for a second. Can surplus energy generated be sold to the grid if availing of TAMS?
That's a grey area at the moment. It wasn't the case. There's a huge need for that to change. For solar to work, there's a need for the energy return to the grid to be paid for. Society should not be getting free energy from people who have made that investment. The likelihood is that will change, and that will all become regulated very soon.
Okay, and Declan, a final question for you. For the rent allowance, how do you prove for your principal private residences if you are no longer a student?
Well, it's your ordinary place of residence where you live and carry on your normal day-to-day business. You have to nominate your principal private residence. If you have a number of residences, you nominate your principal private residence, and it's a matter of fact then.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Declan. And thanks to Declan and Pat for your presentations and for dealing with the questions. I think we've just gone 5 minutes overtime, but I think with the level of interest from the viewers, it was good just to try to address all those questions. I just remind everybody viewing as well that tonight's webinar has been recorded, and it will be made available through the various platforms in the coming days through IFAC and through the Agricultural Science Association. I think we've got a fantastic insight into the budget and how it's going to affect our personal and business finances from Declan and Pat. Again, I think it's a huge effort on both their behalves to actually deliver such detail and such content so quickly after the budget has been released. So on behalf of IFAC, the Agricultural Science Association, and the Irish Farmers Journal, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening and wish you a good night. Thank you.